This is episode 5 of the Break Even Brothers podcast. I'm your host, Bennett Bernard, and my co-host, Bradley Bernard. How was your week, Brad?
It was good. Had a bachelor party this weekend. Went to LA. It was like a huge villa. So it had like a tennis court, basketball court, giant pool, jacuzzi. Was a ton of fun. It was like 13 dudes. And yeah, fun activities. First time I played sports, and tried really hard in a long time. So that was a lot of fun. Got a good sweat in, but got like a major sunburn. Had to, make sure I'm okay after that. But yeah, it was fun. Nice weekend. Basketball and pickleball. So I feel like we did like the basketball camps growing up,
Yeah.
like all the time. And I feel like after that I never really played because I was mostly into coding and gaming. But then like going back to basketball, I'm always like, can I dribble? Can I shoot? Like I feel like it's always different coming back after a long time. And I wasn't terrible, which I was happy about. Like I wasn't awkward dribbling or anything, but definitely not as good as the old days. Not that I was any good, but going through the drills and stuff, you're a little bit better.
Yeah, you did more of the Friday Night Light stuff than the basketball stuff, I feel like. Yeah, I did the basketball stuff. That's cool. Yeah, no, my weekend was good. Pretty uneventful, I think, or I just can't remember much of it. Not for any crazy partying at all, but just, just surviving out here in the desert heat. So
what was the temp?
Like 110, 108.
Ooh.
Yeah.
It was 90, I think, in LA, which felt really warm, but I don't think I could do 110.
Yeah, I can't either. Where in LA was it at?
It was like Beverly Hills area. So you kind of from where I'm at, it's like an hour drive, and then you drive through kind of like not the most nice area. Then you kind of go straight up into the hills, and our like Airbnb was at the top of the hill, so I had this beautiful view. It was great. It was definitely an expensive weekend, but it was fun.
Cool. So it sounds like both had pretty good weekends. So one thing I wanted to talk about was bots. And there's a reason behind why I've been thinking about that. But before I get into my own reasons, people should know, and our audience should know, that you have built many bots and many different kinds of bots, all doing different kinds of things. And so I don't know if you'd consider yourself a bot expert, but when I see you do them or when I've heard you talk about them, I feel like you have a lot of excitement about building bots. So I guess tell me if that's wrong or right, and kind of what your thoughts are. And if you can share some of the bots that you've built, it might be interesting for people to hear.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think optimizing and creating some sort of pipeline to do something for me that I would do manually is a lot of fun. It's like fun on the technical side, fun on like the reward side. So you pull it off correctly, it's definitely worth it. But I think stepping back a bit, bots has like a few different connotations. So you can think of like the negative connotation of like a sneaker bot or like a Ticketmaster bot, something that's, beating the lines, buying something and kind of not doing something in a fair way. There's other bots that, are less harmful, something that can automate an action that you do in your life. So one bot that I had built that was completely harmless was I was in New York, I think in 2022 for about a month. I was in Brooklyn. And when I entered a gym that me and my housemates went to, there's this system that would count how many people were at the gym. And it blew my mind that I could figure out the accurate count of people in the gym. So I went to the front desk guy and I said, hey, like I saw online, you have a people counter. I'm like, do you know how that works? And the front desk guy's like, no, I have no clue. Like, we bought the software or whatever. And so what I did is I pulled up their website, which has this live person counter. I see it. I'm walking in and out of the gym. It's literally updating. Like as I close the door, as I open the door, I tell my friends like, hey, 3 people go walk through, like look down. So, maybe it won't be able to detect it. And it got it right every single damn time. And I was like, holy crap, that's cool. And so the reason why I had built a bot for this, the bot I built was essentially tracking the gym population over time, just to graph it, just to take a look at it, because when we're out there, it was a little bit crowded. It was a climbing gym, had lifting as well. But since we were kind of like working from home and like on the weekends, we want to figure out when's the best time to go. So I probably wrote a bot in an hour, built up a Laravel application that essentially went to their website, took that live counter number, and then just stored it in a database like every minute. And so that probably ran for 2 days. Then I pulled in a simple charting library, charted this over time, and you could see like when the gym was popular, when it wasn't popular. And so that was a fun one because the technology that the gym used was super advanced. I like went into their webpage, inspect element on Chrome, saw where they're pulling that data from, I then wrote like simple code to do the same thing. They just had an API they were hitting and that returned the count. So I did the exact same thing for my web app, scraped it, put it in a chart, showed everyone at my house and said, hey, here's the raw data. Like, this is when we should go. And that one was so harmless, but I don't know. I had so much fun building it. I feel like it actually helped us because we went to the gym at a less crowded time. But yeah, there's plenty that I've made that are along similar lines or different lines. And it's so much fun. Like, I really do enjoy it.
Yeah, that's cool. I was going to ask you, and then you kind of touched on it, but I wanted to double click on it a little bit. Is you looked at the website, like the HTML elements,
Mhm.
and was that number? It was a value, like a static value that you grabbed, or you said it was like an API that was updating that number on their website.
Yeah, so they had a web page. That web page was making API requests to a different service, that service that they paid for. That service was keeping an accurate count. So their page was just basically refreshing the API like every minute or every like real-time event. So all I had to do is look at their source code, see how they're making that request to the other service, emulate that on my bot, and I was off to the races. And I think I live coded it in front of my housemates. And I was like, here's my idea. Like, should I do it? And people were like, hey, if you want. And like, I would do it anyways, but it'd be nice if people were like, oh, I really wanted that, you know? So I was like, okay,
Yeah.
I'll do it. And I think I completed it in like an hour, deployed it with Laravel Forge. It was all set up and going. And I remember everyone that I was living with at the time was like, wow, like, you're like a super nerd. Like, you really love this. I was like, yeah, I mean, this is so much fun. Like, I could do this all day. I mean, if it paid the bills, that'd be great. But usually it's some side project kind of thing that I'm
Yeah.
hacking on.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm surprised that you're able to request hit the API that they're paying for. I guess I'm just
Mhm.
surprised that is that normal? Like, is that typically what you see in those kinds of services? Like, or was that a bit like you're surprised that you're able to hit it?
I was a little bit surprised, but if you can see it on the website and they're making requests to a different API to get it, there's a high chance that you can just emulate that. If I loaded the page and that count was already on there, I wouldn't know where it came from. And so I'd just have to reload the page and pull out that number. But since it was pretty transparent on how it was done, it was pretty easy. But yeah, for all the bots that I made, some are super difficult, some require a lot of code, some are very, very straightforward. It really depends on the use case. And I think the more fun ones, it's a little technically challenging. So you learn something along the way, but you also get that satisfaction of, hey, it worked. Like, this is something that I could repeat and do again and code in
Hmm.
Python, code in Swift, like literally whatever it is, PHP, whatever you need to get the job done. Like it's super fun.
Yeah, that's cool. One of the bots that you've built was, and I'll kind of start it off, but then you can take it from there, is at the height of the pandemic and everyone was getting a Peloton and there was like
Hmm.
a waiting list or there was some kind of like just backlog and it was really difficult to get one. But you had to come up with a solution, get to the front of the line, or it was to get like straight to customer service where you could like talk
Hmm.
to someone to get the bike. So remind me exactly because I remember using it and it worked. All the
Yeah.
technical aspects were completely beyond my understanding, but remind me, I guess, what that was and how you pulled that off and what was that bot doing exactly?
Yeah. So I had ordered a Peloton probably like in the 2021 era, I think maybe in June. I looked online, like, how can I get a faster delivery date? Because people on Reddit said, hey, if you reach out to customer support, some people cancel their delivery and you can kind of swoop in and get that bike delivery. So I had first started chatting their support probably like once a day saying, hey, here's my order number, here's my email. Is there any openings today? And the usual response is no, but like, hey, check back in later. And so I thought, along the lines of making a bot, like it'd be fun to chat the customer support regularly because I imagine for these chat support tools, at least for some of mine, it shows you the chat history. So if you chat back again and again, you'll see it. But I was like, I wonder if they have that history. And two, if they don't, it'd be great to just be like an automatic chatter. So I could open their live chat, log in as my email, send them a message saying, hey, I'm open for a delivery in the next like 2 to 3 days. Do you have anything? And see what they say. And so it started off like simply as that. What I did is I used a Python tool to automate controlling the browser. So it wasn't anything that I did like under the hood. I wasn't mimicking any API requests. This was simply like boot up a browser, click on their like chat icon. From there, like fill out all the inputs as if you're typing in text manually. And then I built out essentially a series of questions and responses that people would ask me. So as I've been chatting them manually, I kind of built up a repository of questions that if I said, hey, do you have a delivery date the next few days? And they would say, no, but we have one then, or no, but check back later. And so all the responses that I got, I collected and basically created logic to walk throughout like a correct response each time. And so this is before the age of AI. So you can imagine a giant if else list of like, if the agent had these keywords in their response, respond with this. And it was super fun. I think I deployed it after like a week or two, and I was just glued to my machine watching it auto chat. Every time I would chat people, it'd print out the log. So there'd be a giant log file that I said this, the agent said that. And after each session, I'd take a look at it, update the code because maybe an agent said something different, and then move forward. So it continuously got better, and I was sitting there watching it. I think in the height of it working, I was chatting every hour, which is absolutely absurd. And the conversation would maybe last 10 minutes. I think even sometimes I had an overlapping conversation where I had a chat and it'd take so long because they kind of ping pong back and forth. I'd have another chat, but I was sitting there like, oh, is this going to work? And so the TLDR is that after running it for probably about a week, it did speed up my delivery. I think I was quoted for a few months and I ultimately got it maybe in like 2 weeks. So I'd run the bot every hour would chat. I look at the logs, see like the result, and my delivery date was like continuously getting moved up because these slots opened. Then it got to a point where it's like, hey, it's next week. And that's good enough for me. So I canceled the bot. But then I told people, I was like, hey, I built this cool thing, automatically chatted, had enough logic to figure out what the agent was saying and respond appropriately. Because, if they ask you what dates work for you and you're asking them, hey, something completely garbage, they're going to be like, we don't understand that. Like, what are you saying? So it took a bit of time to figure out the right logic, but yeah, it was really fun. Another like, scratch my own itch. I want to get a faster delivery. How can you make that happen? Well, you could call in, you could chat them, pretty much anything you can think of. But this way, once I built out all the code, it was all autopilot. I literally just turned it on, had a cron job that ran this Python script that booted up the browser, that chatted them, and then had the log so I could take a look at it afterwards. But yeah, that one was fun. I think I had a nice challenge for that one because it's not my first time automating the browser, but it's always fun to do that. And I think things changed over time too, so I had to like update what elements I was clicking on as the chat changed. But yeah, super fun.
Yeah, and useful too. I think you brought up a good point about wanting to automate things that are boring or just you'd have to otherwise sit there and manually do. And certainly accounting, and I think a lot of other jobs, not just accounting, but people have things like that they do, and they say internally like, oh, this is so mundane and monotonous and routine, like if only I had a robot to do it. And I think prior non-technical people would have a lot of trouble like implementing that prior to like some of the advances that there is now with these AI models. But still, I think it does get to, I think naturally humans are, you can say they're lazy because they don't want to do like, they want as much reward as possible for doing the least amount of work, generally speaking. And I think that's okay. Also too, people want to do things that give them value. And I think people recognize when like there's a really mundane task, like say Peloton, talking to customer service, like that's not a task like anyone wakes up and says, I want to talk to customer service today.
Yeah.
So like automating that is, on your behalf is just a cool thing to do. And like I said, there's so many things like within accounting that would be useful too, that I'm not quite sure. I'm sure there's a lot of different like software providers and like vendors that give accounting firms the ability to like, have bots almost, or like automate certain transaction matching. If there's like, if you're doing like bank feeds and you have to match transactions together, I'm sure there's software now where it can like look at that and then kind of guesstimate what matching you do based on like historical data that you can provide. But all in all, it kind of goes back to that thing where it's like people want to be doing things that are meaningful and not manual and not meaningful. So yeah, bots are cool, and it it kind of has a little bit of a hackerish feeling towards it.
Yeah, one that I created recently, it was for March Madness, I think. But it was like a Chipotle bot is what I called it. And essentially during the NBA games, I think if anyone made a perfect free throw, which was like a 1-for-1, 2-for-2, or 3-for-3, the Chipotle Twitter account would tweet out an image. Inside the image would be a code. Kind of think of like a CAPTCHA or something that's like the words are, or the letters in the code are kind of malformed and jumbled, just so it's a little bit harder for people to get the code. And so you had to immediately take that code, text it to a short telephone number, like an 888-222 or something. Once he sent that code, I think the first 150 or 500 people or something would get a free Chipotle entree. And so I went to Portland, and my friends were watching the game, and he had pulled up his phone, his laptop, and the TV screen. I said, "Hey, man, what are you doing? Like, why do you have so many devices out?" And he's like, "Well, I'm just watching because I want to get free Chipotle." And right then, I was like, "Okay, like now we're talking." There's a little bit of downtime, like we're visiting them, but I was like, "Okay, I'm always up for the challenge. Like, what do we got here?" So I looked at how he's doing it, and I think he had like the Twitter feed on his desktop, watching the game on the TV, and then he had his phone like ready to text. And I think he also had the NBA live feed of the game. So the TV has a bit of a delay, but the live feed, if you go online, is much more up to date. And so I was like immediately diving in. I was like, how quick can I make a bot? Because sometimes I get a little overconfident, maybe 30 minutes, an hour, whatever. But this one gave me a run for my money because there's a few different steps. You had to first detect the perfect free throw. Then you had to wait for Twitter for them to post the image. Then once that image was out, you had to send it to AI and say, like, extract the code that starts with free for free from this image, take that code and then pipe it through a text message. So it's a series of steps. I think the first challenge was getting the timing right for detecting the event, because on the NBA live feed, a perfect free throw would happen. And this live feed was powered through a JSON API. So I was able to create a Mac app that you could click start, type in like the game ID that was on NBA.com. It would consistently pull in this feed. It would have to detect when a perfect free throw was done. Once that's done, it kicks off like, hey, we're on step 2. But there's a bit of a delay. Obviously, like TV happens quick, or TV happens slow, NBA is fast. So like I had to configure a sliding delay of, hey, do I wait 5 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds? And while that was engaged, I'd be listening to the Twitter API. And if you're not familiar, the Twitter API went over a crap ton of changes. Essentially, it's nothing like it used to be. Like when Elon came in, he made it only paid. Like you can literally only do things that are useful if you pay Twitter money. So all these apps died essentially overnight. The pricing is outrageous. So what I had to do is do a bit of like reverse engineering on Twitter's side to be able to get tweets from an account. So the end goal is to look at like Chipotle tweets as their handle, fetch their tweets like as fast as I can after this free throw happens. And then the next new tweet that matches a certain format that's expecting the code, look at that tweet, take the image inside the tweet, pull that out, throw it to AI, get the code back, and then send it off on text. And so I had to find a bunch of Twitter tools that were online, like GitHub repositories. There's one that you could type in your Twitter account handle and get like an authentication token. Then you could throw that to the Twitter unofficial API and get back tweets. So I kind of crafted something together, got that to work. Then the next step was integrating with AI. So I think I chose Google's Gemini Flash 1.5, I think, model. And so that one was multimodal. So you can send an image to it and a query and it would do something. So I found the tweet, took the image, sent it to Google. I said, hey, Google, like, give me the code in this image. It returned me, an answer. And it wasn't great all the time. So I had to perform more like text manipulation on top of that. Extracted the code. And then now what do I do with that? Like, how do I get a text message automatically fired off? Well, it turns out on Mac machines, there's a thing called AppleScript. And AppleScript is a scripting language that Apple created that you can actually essentially configure and control applications on your Mac. And so I was Googling around, like, how do I automatically send a text message? And I landed on this AppleScript. And the AppleScript essentially says, like, hey, wake up the iMessage app, set the recipient equal to Chipotle, set the text message body equal to this, and then click send. And so I had essentially configured this whole pipeline, wait for the event, go fetch their Twitter, find the latest tweet, take it to Google. After that's done, send it off to Chipotle, then mark it as like a sent text message. And when I first started building it, it was a headache of getting the timing right. I'd run into Twitter API limits. I'd be fetching too often, and Twitter would say, hey, hold up, like you're fetching too often. So getting that timing right of like 30 to 40 seconds after it happened was key. And then also fine tuning my AI query, because half the time Google will return something wrong or something too long. And I think the code is exactly like 15 characters. So I take the response, make sure it's 15, and then send it off. And it was so much work. I think I spent maybe like 10 hours building this app when I probably could have sat there, done what my friend did, like waited for it to happen, sent off the code. But it was like a challenge. Like, how far can I get? What
Hmm.
roadblocks am I going to run into? And what am I going to learn along the way? And like
Yeah.
learned AppleScript, learned about Twitter's like not unofficial API, but like kind of the API that runs Twitter.com under the hood. So taking a look at how they actually perform loading tweets, doing all that, and then getting better at AI. Like AI is everywhere now. It's great to be able to perform like an AI image kind of processing task. And
Hmm.
then yeah, just like if you can coordinate all that together, it might sound simple, but the timing was had to be as fast as possible. Like everything had to be queued up and be perfect. And so I built that. It failed like a ton of times, adjusted it, and then finally near the end, like I think it was near the end of the series, or it wasn't March Madness, it was the finals, I think. Near the end of the series, I had got it in its perfection. So I would literally,
Hmm.
the game started, I'd click start, I'd sit back and I'd say, okay, I am confident this is going to work. And the second the first, perfect free throw came in, boom, like I'd watch my app. And so it had like three pipelines of a Mac app. The first one would be like, hey, a highlighted event, that perfect free throw. Boom. Then you see this like loading spinner on fetching tweets. And then you see the tweet pop up. And then I take that and pass that to AI. Then you see another loading spinner, like processing AI. And then boom, the third column was a sent text message to Chipotle with the code. And then Chipotle would text you back if you got it. They'd say like off the rim, I think if you were too late or you had the wrong code, or they'd text you back a code, which was you could redeem online and get the entree. And so yeah, first time got it and it worked, and I was sitting there like, oh, this is so cool. Then after that, I just kept it running because I was like, oh yeah, I spent so much time. I don't want to just like pack my bags and go. I think I
Hmm.
got maybe 4 or 5 codes after that where the free throw was made. I watched the whole pipeline in its full beauty, and I got like 3 or 4 more codes. But if you get it right the second time, they send you back the same code you got. So like I didn't get any more, but
Yeah.
it was just a validation in my head of like, oh, I didn't get lucky. Like
Yeah.
it wasn't a one off. Like I was scoring big time on that whole pipeline. And if you looked on Chipotle tweets, you see all these replies that are like, screw bots, screw bots. Like I can't get this fast enough. I'm sitting there like, yeah, I have a bot, but I'm not like doing anything, I would say, too malicious. Like I spent a lot of time
Yeah.
and effort, on it. So it was more of a technical challenge, but I'm sitting there looking at people's responses. I'm like, yeah, there's probably a few others that are spending time botting it, like
Yeah.
me. But yeah, that's kind of the story of the Chipotle one. And also a lot of fun, a lot of work
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, that's cool. It's funny because it reminds me almost of like quantitative trading, where the people in the stock market like write these programs that like
Hmm.
auto trade. I'm certainly not an expert in any of that, but like, know of it. And, is that like technically like by the rules it is, but like there's a lot of people who object to it because it's like can happen in a millisecond. They're booking
Hmm.
and making all these trades. But yeah, that's pretty cool. They got some free food out of the Chipotle bot because
Yeah.
no food is as good as free food. If you ask me, free food's the best
Yeah.
tasting food around. So that's cool.
Absolutely. And I think I packaged my app up and sent it to my friend. The only thing I needed was like full disk access, which is a bit special on Mac because I had
Hmm.
to run like this Apple script touched to your iMessage, and like essentially it just needed to be like a little bit loose on security. But it's a friend sending an app. Like I'm not trying to hack his computer. I was like, hey, if you want it, here it is. Like I'm proud of
Hmm.
it. Um, so yeah, it was cool to be able to create something that was like reusable, integrated with your own messages, and like worked pretty well. So
That AppleScript is pretty interesting. I had never heard of that until you mentioned it. That you can basically code your own computer to do things that are
hmm
like native to. That's pretty cool because I think I know that Microsoft just recently I found this out and I didn't see any news release. I just saw it on my Excel where you can like write in Excel like TypeScript, and I was like, that's really
hmm.
random. And I was trying to think about like potential use cases, and they have some examples of like, this is a TypeScript code that does this, but it
Hmm.
wasn't overly impressive. And in my head, I was thinking like, if you knew TypeScript, which is like a general programming language, right? Like
Hmm.
that's like a
Very
flavor
popular.
of, yeah, it's like a flavor of JavaScript, I want to say that
Yeah,
is right.
JavaScript with types, so like the
Yeah.
better version.
So, in my head though, I was thinking like if you have the knowledge to TypeScript like functionally, why would you feel the need to do a lot of things in Excel in the first place? It's kind of where I was like, I'm not sure where that benefit would be, just because, in my opinion, at least this is for accounting. Maybe there's other use cases, but for accounting, it's I think a lot of the push should be trying to get out of Excel as much as possible, and So like, why would you learn TypeScript just to use it in Excel? Like when you could be learning literally anything else that probably gives you more benefit just more broadly than, learning TypeScript just for Excel. But it's
Yeah.
interesting that AppleScript has that.
Yeah, maybe the automation factor comes into play of, you know, some software engineer comes and is trying to fulfill a request from automating some Excel work. And TypeScript, I think, is one of the most popular languages right now. JavaScript
Hmm.
alone is extremely popular, but TypeScript is definitely succeeding in and being the thing to know across like backend, mobile, web, front end, etc. So yeah, maybe they have gone on a mission to say like we're going to target the most popular language, we're going to enable some sort of automation layer so that if people do are like moving things across files or working with external data systems, whatnot, they have some sort of interface to do that. But yeah, I mean, I think moving things off Excel sounds great, but maybe just working within the confines, and maybe that's been a tall ask for like the Excel team of like, hey, we want more. How can we do that? And like they want to sell Excel, so they're not really going to say, hey, get off Excel, but here's like a language and a tool that you could do that. But yeah, I haven't looked into it. And AppleScript is cool because apps can provide a kind of a way in. So I think, like I mentioned, for the Messages app on Mac, there's a way to send a message. And like for the Mail app, you can send an email. And I think there's a tool when you open up like AppleScript to kind of target an application and like see what levers you can pull to enable functionality within the app that Apple's fully developed. But it's a little bit of like a secret language. It's like
Hmm.
automating Mac apps where if I didn't have this, you can imagine I'm trying to like open up the messages window, like click on new message, like type in Chipotle in the kind of address bar. But all of that is kind of brittle and requires much more effort. And so for
Hmm.
AppleScript, I can copy in like 15 lines of code to say, activate the Messages app, set the recipient, set the body, click send. And it's all
Yeah.
built in because the Messages app exposes that. So I don't think I'll do too much with AppleScript in the future. Like that use case lined up absolutely perfectly. But it's a cool like language and feature of the Apple platform to know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. I remember one bot idea I had a while ago. I think it was during the 2016 election. So, that was Trump versus Clinton. And it wasn't because I was, following the politics much, but it was because I was like, that's when I was really learning a bunch of programming. So it was, that was when I was at Loan Depot, really learning how to use Python and SQL. And, back then that was when the Twitter API was, how it was when you were
Mhm.
describing it before, pre all the new, X changes. And I had an idea, and I wasn't, and I still probably would not be able to make a bot, in the current state of my skill set. But, I remember learning and I was thinking about as an idea, basically looking at like trending topics like in politics on Twitter and like trying to find a way of like trying to get like a phrase or like a viral event that was happening and like basically like print it on like a t-shirt like
Mhm.
all automatically. So like say there
Hmm.
was that really infamous Trump tweet where it was like Cov Fifi or whatever. Like he misspelled something and it was
Mhm.
COVFE. And, like just the idea would be that you just like take something like that, like put it on a shirt and you could
Straight to
like
the
put,
press.
yeah, yeah. Well, like, and just like have it be like not an actual printed shirt and no inventory, but just like
Mhm.
have it be posted. And then if people start buying it, it would be like the just in time inventory where like it
Mhm.
would then
Mhm.
screen print and send it over to them. Now, again, probably didn't have the technical chops to pull that off. I thought it was an interesting idea. But then the other part of me too was like, I don't want to like foment political discourse by like,
Mhm.
having a bunch of shirts that like, print lock her up and then another bunch of shirts that like, say lock him up. I was like, I don't want to be
Yeah,
involved in
yeah.
that business at all. Like a moral issue, I guess. But yeah, it was interesting playing around with the Twitter API in that time too, because that was when I think it was much easier and I don't know if it's easy now, but like much more open than what it
Mhm.
seems to be now these days.
Yeah, and I think there's another category of bots that are absolutely businesses too. Like, as an indie developer over the past 12 months, releasing an app on the iOS App Store, I care about where Chatty Butler ranks on the App Store. So I paid for a service called App Figures, and what they do is they're scraping the App Store for certain keywords. So for Chatty Butler, I'd want to rank for AI agent or AI chat. So I'd go to App Figures, the service, say, here's my app, here's the keywords. Can you please track those like every hour, every day, both for US, for Germany, for iPhone and iPad. And so when I pay for those services, for me as an engineer, especially as a bot creator, I'm thinking, man, I would love to have a business like that where my core logic is spinning up servers that are just consistently scraping the API. So that involves doing a bit of reverse engineering on Apple's devices and hardware, automating that, and then doing that at scale. And so there's tons of companies that are literally scraping data, repackaging, whether that's like cleaning with AI, augmenting with other data sources. Like there's so many possibilities, and then selling it for a subscription.
Hmm.
So I had used that probably for a few months, but like decided to cancel because I wasn't very on top of like App Store optimization. But there's a company called, I think, Bright Data, and they have like a full suite of scraping tools and data sets. So you can pre-purchase like Instagram accounts that have over 1,000 followers and yada yada yada. And so it's pretty interesting to be in a space where there's a lot of business opportunities. So the bots that I created, yeah, scratch your own itch, kind of fun and like throwaway bots. But if you push it a step further and kind of crack the secret sauce on reverse engineering some of these things, some can be really hard. Like Apple is definitely a little bit on the more difficult side. Some can be a bit easier. It's you like taking your software expertise and your kind of security and pen testing and pushing that to the limits and putting that all together. But if you can crack that, I think you could really have an awesome business idea of just automating that and then selling it. Like it's on my
Hmm.
to-do list to have a B2B app that just has a massive scraping engine on some service that people value, and then
Hmm.
just sell it. Like create a few charts, create a few dashboards. Like it doesn't sound too hard to me, and I haven't gone through it yet. But every time I had an invoice from App Figures, it was kind of that dread of like, man, I should be in this business myself
Hmm.
because one, it'd be super fulfilling and fun to like reverse engineer, and two, like tons of people are paying for it. Like it's literally a profitable business with, I'm sure, like millions in annual revenue.
Hmm.
So it's like, how do you make your bot much more profitable and useful than just like these one-off things? Because there's so much out there that people will pay for.
Yeah. Before we move on from bots, one thing that you mentioned with all your bots that I thought was interesting is you talked about using Laravel to deploy these and like using Laravel Forge. I guess from my perspective, I'm as you know, I'm not a Laravel person. What makes that like? Do you have like a routine flow of like, hey, I'm going to make a bot, so I'm going to spin up Laravel, I'm going to like configure the back end. I guess why do you choose like to go? It just seems like such a comprehensive framework for like
Hmm.
a bot. When I think of a bot, I think of like a limited, like there's no UI, probably it's all just running like on a server. So I guess just talk me through why you're such a big fan. I know you're a big fan of Laravel, but like why you think that for bots, like what's your normal flow and like why you use Laravel for that as well.
Yeah, usually bots is just hitting an API with certain configured parameters, headers, and payload. And so you could choose a lot of different languages, Python, Swift, TypeScript, like JavaScript, whatever. For me, it's familiarity and comfortability and speed. So if
Hmm.
I know I need to mimic this API request, like the essentials of a bot is do something and store it in the database or store it in a log file. And Laravel provides you so much power to have like a queue worker, a database, like a front end without much effort. And so you could start off with the skeleton of a bot that fetches data, inserts into a database, and you don't even have a front end. You just open up like your SQL editor and take a look at the raw data in your tables. And depending on what you need, that could be good enough. But I feel like it provides such an excellent foundation, and the amount of like very deep tools that Laravel provides, like for auto scaling a queue worker or like managing queue workers. So for a queue worker, you could think of like a separate entity waiting to run work. And so if I had, for example, an App Store scraper, say if I had 5 customers on my fake App Store scraper and they wanted to check, 20 different keywords. Well, in Laravel, what I could do is I say every hour we want to fetch, the rankings for all these keywords. Once I go through each keyword, I can kick off like a queued job to this queue runner. And there's excellent tools that Laravel provides that can scale this for me. So if I have 5 customers, I have 5 queued jobs, but it depends on how many queue runners you have. So if you have 2 queue runners, it can only run 2 things at one time. But Laravel has excellent tooling that says we can scale these queues up and down dynamically at runtime, depending on the queue load and other factors. And so like pulling all these packages in for free that I've used before that make a lot of sense and aren't a headache, it makes Laravel like an excellent choice to at least start out. I think as you develop more complex bots, you have to make sure you use the right technology. For the Chipotle one, you could have a Laravel version that, again, scrape the NBA feed, scrape Twitter API, but you need to send that text message, and there's zero chance that a server online can send that text message for you. So it has to be tied to your device. So like a different approach I could have taken there was do all the processing on the back end, send like a push notification to my device on my Mac, and then that would then trigger that AppleScript to send the text. And that would be great because I could like interface with multiple computers. I could send it to 50 people, and that processing is only done once on the server. Then 50 people send the text message, and like that would be doing it at scale. But essentially, I did it all on the computer for the Chipotle bot. But for a lot of the other ones, it's collecting and harvesting data using an API request. PHP works. I wouldn't say it's like the best language or the fastest, but the tooling and the infrastructure that Laravel provides that's both free and paid, because it's not all free, works well with my kind of thought process and thought model. And I think PHP is very approachable for like building a web app, building a scraper. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. But I'm a bit of a long-term PHP fan, to say the least. And I think being able to build something really quick and understanding what pieces you need to figure out and get out the door quickly, that's like how I see a successful box. I don't want to be stumbling through a new framework. Like I know exactly what I need to do. It's just how do I do it the fastest and how do I make it like scalable?
Yeah, that makes sense. And just to be clear, we're not sponsored by Laravel at all, but Brad's working
Not
on
yet.
that as we speak.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I'll
just
talk
kidding.
to Taylor.
Cool. One other thing. Sorry, I keep saying one more thing, but you mentioned another thing that was, I think, important, and it kind of got me thinking about, again, as an accounting person, like the state of like the future for my industry. And I feel like bots had that bad rap. They kind of felt hackerish. You hear about like the election bots and like how they were fomenting discourse on Twitter and stuff like that. But I do feel like as they become more approachable, which I think like AI and all the advancements there
Mhm.
are making them hopefully feel more approachable. I feel like it's gonna be that second wave of like offshoring task, right? Because at first, prior to offshoring, all the work was done like within your team locally for the most. And then as like technology advanced and able to work online with the internet, companies started offshoring to like the Philippines and to Mexico and to India and there's places that were a bit, more cost friendly to kind of maintain profits and things like that. I do feel like bots, might be that second or like third coming of like that movement to like reduce costs and be more broadly accepted. So I'll be curious to see, that progresses like in my own industry. Because I think a couple episodes we talked about an article from someone in the accounting profession, Jason Stats, and it was about the first, I can't remember, like 100 million or first $1 million one
Mhm.
person business or something like that. And I think you'd have to rely on like bots to still do all of that kind of mundane, routine, monotonous work. But that might not be so far off these days. Again, with
Mhm.
just how fast things are progressing. Be curious to watch that and see where that goes. But as you were talking, it made me think about the comparison of bots with like offshoring. When that
Yeah.
was really popping off years ago.
It's it's a little bit like we've been seeing a shift in with the new AI world being it used to be software as a service. So you can think of a pre-configured website that you could do, 4 or 5 tasks, and they're very, very well defined. Now with AI being more autonomous agent, have capabilities, now I think it's coined as service as a software, kind of like flipping the narrative a little bit where this AI tool is doing a whole lot more in your process and is able to like function as like almost like a human. And when you're using the software, like you're the human driving the software. Now in the AI world, it's like this AI agent is involved in your process and is doing all these tasks for you. And so there's a few companies out there that do that well. I think one's called Gumloop, essentially like an AI builder workflow. So you can imagine a drag and drop interface, a little bit complicated, but you can connect this data source to that one, create these automations that your company can run. And it's like using your own data. So you connect like your Google account, these other accounts. And from that, you can create pretty complex AI automations or AI agents. So that's kind of the future. And I think with that, Meta just released Llama 3.1, which was a huge deal. This is a model that's been a long time coming. So Meta first released Llama 3, I don't know, what feels like maybe a few months ago, but the AI landscape moves so fast, it's hard to even remember with all these companies one-upping each other. But they released Llama 3, I think it was 7B and 70B. And you can think of the 7B and 70B as the intelligence level. With higher intelligence, it's slower and more expensive. So a 7B is not as smart, faster to run, but good enough. And then 70B is slower to run, but smarter. And so this time around, they actually came out with their esteemed, I think it was 405B, so 405 billion. This one's very expensive to run, but extremely smart. So it's expensive, it's slow, but it's smart. And so with this release, I think Meta went full open source, like described exactly how they trained it, described exactly what it should be used for, how people can replicate it. And once these open models are out there, there's all these genius folks that take a look at it, like fine tune it to their use case, like improve on what Meta's done. There's so many different methods and like secrets in the AI model space that as Meta puts out such a high class model, like we can only wait and see over the next weeks and months how much better that one's going to get. So it's pretty crazy. I think like Zuckerberg's approach is let's make something powerful and free and see what happens. And the community kind of went nuts, overnight of, wow, this is out. I can't wait to build with it. And just thinking about Meta releasing this, it's clearly upping the ante. And I bet OpenAI is kind of shivering right now, being like, okay, when's our model coming out? Because that's literally neck and neck. Google, Meta, Anthropic, it's never ending. I think intelligence is racing towards absolute zero. And at that point, I'm not really sure how the world's going to react because I'm not really ready for it. I don't think a lot of people really grasp like having an extremely smart, capable person, bot, agent, whatever you want to call it, at your fingertips 24/7. Could have thousands of them too. You could have a company with 1,000 people that, are all AI bots. And it's super odd to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like the Matrix a little bit, that whole movie
Yeah.
plot. Like we're going down that road. But
Yeah.
one thing that is interesting, and yeah, the open source, approach, I think is the one, just from my own, humble opinion, I think is the one that'll be here to last a little bit longer. And I think we've talked before about, how to know when to choose different models and like data
hmm
security that comes with those. Like OpenAI isn't really open. It's kind of a weird
hmm
oxymoron because I don't think they're very open in terms of like how the whole process works. And it's interesting to see with Llama, like I do think that's the future where businesses will want to use these models more. And I think from my own understanding, using Llama, using an open model gives them a bit more transparency and control over the inputs and how it got to those kinds of results or answers. But I did want to take one, I guess, slight right turn on this conversation because one of the things that I've been interested in personally is, okay, Llama's here, it's great, but like, how does someone like actually run it? Like, give me some practical steps and like what's involved in like running Llama because you said it was really expensive, but then
hmm
it's like open source. So I guess to the layman, explain that piece. Like, how is it expensive, and how would someone go about, setting that up on their own local machine?
Yeah, so there's a few different flavors. There's these companies that are building out GPU infrastructure in the cloud. So you can think of Grok, which I talked about last time, but essentially taking these open source models, putting it on their fleet of GPUs from NVIDIA or other like advanced chips, and then running inference on it. And so there's two steps in the AI pipeline. One is training. So taking all these GPUs and having go through all this training and have like an output of weights. And weights is kind of like the bread and butter of the AI model. Once that's done, Meta releases like the weights, and then these companies take these weights, take all the code, and then put it on their GPUs. And now the GPU is ready for inference. And so inference is the traditional sense that we talk about where we ask a question and we get a response. And so it uses all that training under the hood to then power those responses. And so there's a few different takes. There's as a developer, you can go to any of, 5, 10, 15, 20 is what it feels like platforms these days that have their GPUs, have infrastructure to scale, and have an API that you can hit that will access Llama 3, Llama 3.1, Llama 3.1, 4, or
Hmm.
5B, all that. As a engineer or someone who wants to tinker with it, a whole different approach. If you want it on your local machine on your Mac, I think there's a tool called Llama. Like
Hmm.
maybe it stands for open source Llama. I'm not really sure. I haven't used it, but I've seen a lot of it on Twitter. And I believe the gist of it is that you download this Mac application. It provides you an easy way to download the model in a way that if you're not an engineer, or maybe you are, it's kind of hidden behind the scenes. You click download, it appears on your machine, and then you're presented with a familiar chat interface that you can then test out the model. And again, as we talk about the different sizes and the different classes of the Llama 3.1 model, there's like 7B, so small, fast, not as smart. There's like 90, and then there's the big one, 405. And so if you take that 405 one, try to run that on a MacBook Pro with 96 gigs of RAM, it's still going to chug through. Like the response that you'll see if you ask a question, they call it tokens per second, and you can imagine that as how many characters are being printed out in the way that it answers. And so if you ran 405B, you'd get high intelligence, but it would take a long time, maybe a minute or two to generate a simple response. So that's why all these companies are deploying their GPU clusters. But there's a whole nother kind of advancement that, again, I'm not super into AI and ML. I'm more of a product builder, but I'll give you the layman's kind of description is they're trying to take these models and kind of downsize them. So downsize them, but keep the intelligence level. So they'll take something like Llama 7B and like quantize it, which what I believe means is like take 90% of the intelligence and make it smaller. And making it smaller means it runs faster and cheaper on computers, so therefore you get the benefit of it, but it does lose a bit of the precision. So it's how far can you take that such that it's not a crappy model anymore. So like how much can we downscale it so that it's able to run on consumer hardware, not giant GPUs. So yeah, it's a little bit of a process, and it depends on what model size you choose, but there is a decently large community and tooling if you want to check it out on Ollama that you can download it, get your model set up, choose a small one because you don't want to wait forever, and then just kind of tinker with it and see which ones you like.
That quantizing, that's like file compression, basically, like in a different terminology.
I think so. I mean, I know there's a whole lot that goes into it that
Yeah,
is
yeah.
not really my wheelhouse, but yeah, you can imagine like compressing and making things smaller for the sake of trying to keep performance, but mostly to make it easier to run on consumer grade hardware. So you don't need to spend $5,000 for a giant, NVIDIA chip. You can run it on, maybe $500 CPU with, 32 gigs of RAM.
Yeah. That compression reminds you. I think there's a company called Pied Piper that was doing that or something like that. The
I
compression.
think they went under.
Uh, yeah, something happened. Um, yeah, well, it's interesting with Llama, and one of the things that I think is important for companies looking to build, on platforms is like there's not as much a vendor lock in. I think there's an article that I will put in the
Mhm.
show notes, one that I wanted to share is it's titled "Why Meta's 3.1 is a boon for enterprises and a bane for other LLM vendors." It's from InfoWorld. But basically, in the article, it talks about the release that we talked about, the model 3.1. But one of the things that it addressed, which I was like, oh yeah, absolutely makes perfect sense, is the ability to have something that is you're not like paying for a service or like a subscription, and they can just
Mhm.
shut off the keys at any time. You
Yeah.
can set it up and run it on your local machines, or like you said, you can do all the
Mhm.
GPU cluster magic that they do. But like that ability to like build on something that feels more durable and within your control, I think is huge. And again, especially from my lens in dealing with financial data, I think we talked like a couple episodes ago, like financial data is probably like second only to like health data in terms of like what
Mhm.
kind of data is confidential. And so being able to feel like that is in a controlled environment that's not subject to OpenAI or Anthropic or whoever else just
Yeah.
turning it off or getting acquired. Like I think that is something that's gonna be interesting to see too. And what if I was to start building an AI product now in the accounting world, I would assume that like going Llama is like the best approach just based on that alone. But it's interesting to see that get called out in the article too, because that does feel like it's a very important thing for companies to be considering. Like what does this mean
Yeah.
long term? Can I feel comfortable building on this?
Yeah, it's usually, you choose the best model. And again, at the frequency of releases that these models are coming out, both closed source, which you can think of OpenAI, oddly enough, and then open source on Meta's side. It's every month things change. And at the end of the day, it's pricing and availability. So Meta comes out with their new model. It's like open source, available for commercial use. And then boom, like overnight, the expectations and standards are changed. And I do feel bad for a little bit bad for all the people that are doing the closed source, because as some of these companies aren't as good as like OpenAI or other ones, I'm sure they're spending, 500 million or 200 million. I'm not really sure, but spending a lot of money trying to train a new model. And if Meta just releases one overnight without much, discussion, that's like already better than what you're aiming at, then all that money that you spent is kind of worthless. So I think as the intelligence level raises in these general models, as open source gets better, I imagine that people with not as much money are going to back out and say, hey, like we can't compete with Meta. Like there's no way. Like they have a giant GPU cluster. They have tons and tons of data, tons of engineers, tons of, ML research scientists. It's not going to be in our best interest. And so I think we'll converge to be the open source and the larger companies, and then the closed source companies who can still compete. There's lots of talented folks at OpenAI that, they started the craze. They were leading it, or you could say they are. It's definitely neck and neck between like Google, Anthropic, Meta, and OpenAI. But it's something that I think when AI first started, people were like, oh, I want to get into creating my own models. And personally, for me, I was never interested because it takes so much research and a whole different expertise. How can I build cool applications on it? And now being, a year later, I think it's even more important to continue to be on the building products with it side, because that race to extreme high intelligence with extreme low costs, it's not exciting, and it's something that
Mhm.
these companies are going to do anyways. So trying to beat that, I think it is a fool's game. I think someone from Meta who's leading a bit of the AI stuff had kind of reached or said something on Twitter that, hey, if you're building models, like just be careful, because these large companies have the money, they have the resources, and they're going to come up with some good stuff. So if I were you, I would think of the next product you can build with an even smarter model, because that model is coming. It's not a if, it's just a when. So
Yeah. Well, in that article too that I mentioned just a second ago, they talk about like rival LLM providers and like what the
mhm,
Llama release means. And there's actually a person, like an expert. I'm not familiar with their name. I think it's in the article, but basically, there's a quote that talks about like these companies called Cohere and Aleph
mhm,
Alpha. I guess those are some of the closed source models that are out there that are maybe not as well known,
mhm.
OpenAI and like that. But basically, the person kind of calls out that like, hey, they're probably not going to survive this as this
Yeah.
keeps going because they don't have the budgets and the researchers and all that. But they do say, or they'll survive in a much smaller niche, and like that's something
Mhm,
that I think is interesting too, because I think that the term AGI, where it's like artificial general intelligence, right? Like that's the
mhm.
kind of like milestone that people talk about hitting, but that's general intelligence. I'm certainly not a technical person, but in an industry that's really niche, for example, like I'll just take mortgage because that's where I have background in and have some familiarity with. There's so many different rules and regulations. There's so many different parties. It's a really complicated transaction. I think like 80% of people surveyed saying that buying a house is one of their most stressful
Mhm,
endeavors. And so like there's all that knowledge that is part of that specific domain. And I don't think anyone would consider being an expert in those areas as like general intelligence. And so I do wonder like if there will eventually be spin-offs of like specialized LLMs for like these different purposes, or if people will just, fine tune their llama model to be specific for their niche. And then that just serves as like, this is our internal resource. It'll be interesting to
mhm.
see how that all kind of plays out for sure.
Yeah, there is one called Harvey. I think it's a legal variant of GPT-3 or 3.5, but they were pretty early, and they essentially, yeah, trained on a bunch of legal documents because they wanted like a lawyer counterpart or something along those lines. And I think with Meta releasing such an intelligent base model, it makes those fine tunes even better. So fine tuning, you can think of, just shoving all this knowledge that's particular to one domain, and the AI agent or AI model is still good at what, general intelligence, but has this, refined focus in a certain area. And getting a good fine tune, how much that costs, how much that saves you, because if you don't fine tune, you can do other prompting techniques like inserting examples of good questions and answers. So you could have like a 5,000 character prompt that says, hey, if you're answering legal questions, here's a few good examples of answers that we like. Now answer this question. So it takes a look at what you've sent, tries to mimic it, but fine tuning, what it does is provide all that knowledge of like good question answering in one stage. Then the model gets retrained a little bit, like adjusting a little bit of its intelligence to be pointed more that direction. And then now you don't need to have a large prompt. It already knows what's a good answer and what's in that domain. So I think it's gonna be really popular. I wish I knew and like more to do a fine tune, because it feels like a hackerish thing of, oh, I took Llama 3.1. I'm going to make it an expert Laravel programmer. So I'm going to feed it all the Laravel docs. I'm going to feed it all the PHP docs. And then after that, I can ask it any question. It could do my, Laravel projects for me. And I think that is super cool, but it costs a lot of money to fine tune. It's similar to training, but a lot of these providers are now accepting that. So I think OpenAI literally like 2 days ago was saying, come fine tune GPT 4.0, their latest model. And then Google, I think in the next week or two, is going to unlock fine tuning for for Gemini Flash 1.5. And so that's like a whole unlock where I think people are waiting and saying, these base models are so good, I want to go a little bit further in this direction. How do I do that? And this fine tune will unlock that. Then you can basically compare, like, here's the base model, here's my fine tune model, give them the same question, see how they perform and iterate on that.
Yeah, that's cool. I plan on, I think a couple episodes we talked about a use case I was trying to do with Amazon Alexa, and basically creating an Alexa skill that would read off a like game guide for like the Hello Kitty Island Adventures game, and then be able to siphon back the answer from that guide. And at the time I was having trouble because I was trying to use ChatGPT's API, and I was just lightly tinkering with it. But what I want to do since the release of Llama is actually install 7DB and use that Llama tool to like try and do that again, because it'd be hosted on my machine. Try and have it do that multimodal where it can kind of like manage multiple windows, I guess, right? And also do the RAG. You talked about that one time. It was like retrieval, whatever that was. Yeah. So I want to actually implement that now and be really curious to see what that process is like building on it. And hopefully I can get it to a place where it works. And then I can also like compare that with, I've been using Anthropic's, Claude a bit more than ChatGPT these days, and using those like artifacts where like it tells you like how it did it a bit more. So I want to kind of compare and contrast, if I try and build the same skill with like, Claude versus, Llama that's running locally, and just, how that feels and how the answers are. So I'm going to start doing that because it's having the builder's itch a little bit right now, and I think it'll be a fun little project. And if I can get it, if I can get it posted, I'll be excited because I could tell my kids, hey, this is the skill that I'll say we made it together, and you can ask Alexa anything about Hello Kitty, and she'll provide all the answers you need. So and Dad can sit back and be like, instead of having to Google everything every time they ask me something, I can just sit back and be like, just ask Alexa. She knows. Yeah, exactly. So it'll be interesting. So I'll keep us updated. I don't know to the extent of when I can work on it, but as I work on it, I'll make sure I'll bring some notes back to this podcast, because it'd be kind of fun to do some updates on that kind of thing.
I think if you're using AI tools now, just a quick shout out, Claude is definitely the best, and they have a free version. So if you go to claude.ai, you're presented with their latest model, which I think is 3.5 Sonnet, ranks really high across a ton of different benchmarks. And then, like Ben mentioned, it has this artifact view. So you have a main chat, you ask it a question. If it needs to write code, if it needs to produce some other resource, it does a split pane where on the right side will be an artifact. So it kind of gives you more context, more understanding of what it's doing. And you probably get, 10 messages a day for free. I've paid for like the premium version, so I get more, and it's absolutely excellent to write code, to reason about, to improve, like literally anything. It's super, super smart and accurate. But there is a decent learning curve to prompting AI. It's like a never-ending game of understanding which model you're talking to, how it works best. But I think Claude, in the general sense, is absolutely worth $20 a month. And hey, maybe next week OpenAI drops GPT-5, and next week on the pod I'll say switch to GPT-5. But in the current standing of all things, I think Claude reigns supreme by a decent margin. But hey, I hope it's beaten, because every time a new model pops out, I'm like, it's time to build. Like I get the itch too, and I imagine all these other engineers and creators are thinking the exact same thing of, like, what does this unlock for me? What can I do now that either was too expensive or too difficult to pull off that the intelligence level couldn't? So yeah, it's a world of opportunity out there right now.
Yeah, that's cool. Lots of updates going on with the models. And speaking of updates, let's segue into the next thing we wanted to catch up on. And you mentioned last week that you were doing some interviews, and I guess did you want to give any
Hmm.
updates on how that's been, kind of dipping your toes back in that world, and any news to share?
Yeah, a little different. The last time I interviewed was 2021 before joining Meta, and so at that time, there's definitely a few companies that at that time I was like, oh, I'll apply to X or Y or Z, and they're pretty known mobile companies. So I've been an iOS engineer by trade, but built web apps on the side for what feels like forever now, maybe 10 plus years. And so this time took a look back at like my Excel doc that had all the job applications that I was going for last time, and probably 20 or 30% of those companies are now hiring iOS, but outside the US. So that
Mm,
means like Mexico City or Brazil. So it's a little bit of a different environment. So I think it's kind of cutting costs a little bit, finding like more cost effective labor elsewhere. So there's like senior iOS roles or iOS roles. And it's not specific to iOS, but I've seen a trend of these companies kind of shifting outside the US to see what other talent is out there. On top of that, they're building offices in these areas too. So it's not like fully remote. It's creating like a whole community, a large investment like India, Brazil, Mexico City are the main ones that I've seen. But yeah, it's a little different. And on top of that, like I'm in Irvine now, much different than being in the heart of like South Bay and like the San Jose area. So when I look at these companies during COVID, everyone was remote. There was no question. Like if you worked at a company, you're doing video calls and that's how life was. Now it's a little different. So there were companies that in the COVID era said remote is here to stay. You know, we're a remote company, remote first, kind of rebranded themselves because at that time, a lot of people were job hopping and that was a plus. Now it's kind of coming back the other way. And so, like, return to office, RTO is very much in effect. There's a lot of companies, again, that I have wanted to work at for a long time, but either they have an RTO policy, so it's a little bit more difficult for me. And it's a little bit of a surprise too, because I think a lot of these companies will say they're remote or like they were remote in COVID. Then I hop on a call with a recruiter or like learn more about their position, and it's back in office 3 days a week, 5 days a week, usually a hybrid model, but at least some days in office. And for me, when I was at Meta, I didn't go in too often. Definitely was comfortable at home. Wasn't a super far commute for me, but felt productive and efficient and did a lot of great work at home. I did go in occasionally to like socialize and do all that. And I really enjoyed it. And now 12 months of working for myself, I definitely have like that social, like I want to get back out there, like an in-office job, it doesn't sound as bad. I think when I was pretty focused on remote work, I was very comfortable. Now I've done remote work and a little bit more of an isolated context. So my thoughts are, yeah, like remote is fine. I'd be happy to do it, but in office sounds fine too. I used to be a bit more opposed to it, but now kind of opening things up and thinking, like with the way that things are and the trends that I'm seeing in office, is maybe a 50% chance for me wherever I land in my next gig. Again, probably remote preferred, but like I would be happy to have a cool team because I don't even remember what it's like to be in office like on a consistent basis. Like I think the
mhm.
last time I did that was pre-COVID and it was normal. Everyone went in 5 days a week. Like if you work from home, it was kind of like, oh, are you getting a house repair? Like, are you sick or whatever? Nowadays, or at least when I was working for Meta, like being remote was very normal. Everyone was remote. Now, as we come back to like the RTO status, it's going to be a little bit different. And I think a lot of these companies have pushed people back to the office, but some have done a stronger effort to do that. So, hey, like your
Mm,
performance will be impacted or you might be laid off. Others are kind of like a soft push. So, hey, we're coming back to the office at this date. If you're remote, like you're fine. You don't have to come back. If you're within, 20 miles of the office, come back. So, yeah, definitely a little bit different. I think it used to be a lot easier, if I'm being frank, like interviewing in out of college, interviewing after PayPal, interviewing after LinkedIn. Companies were eagerly hiring in office, but that was the norm, so it wasn't that different. Now it feels like there's a shift to do offshore hiring, a shift to do back in person. So the status quo of the 2021 COVID era has shaken things up quite a bit. And I think when you're not job seeking in the software world, it's a little bit easy to be removed from it and not like, you're not looking at job postings every day. At least I wasn't. Like only when I was searching for a job was I looking what's out there. Now, as I've been talking to friends and telling people, people are definitely a bit surprised. Like it's a little bit of a, oh wow, like that's how things are. Like for better and for worse, like depends how you read it, but it's a change up, and it's something that I think a lot of people are struggling with because a lot of people got laid off in the software world over the past 2 years. A lot of companies like aren't hiring too. There's plenty that I would like to work at or think highly of, and I go to their positions and they're just not hiring at all. So it's like lack of hiring, location change, or like RTO change, and then like hiring outside the US. So all those things considered, definitely a different job market. However, there's still plenty of opportunities out there that I'm excited about. But I think coming into it, a little bit of a wake up call to say, oh, things are different, some for better, some for worse. But at the end of the day, it's like there's still companies that I'm excited about and talking to now and happy to move forward with. But I think my impression of like getting interviews faster or being able to apply to like, the quote unquote top companies and hearing back really fast, like things are just a bit slower, a bit different. And I think if you're like a recruiter in the space, you probably felt it. But if you're an engineer, you'll definitely only feel it once you start applying. It's not something you can really, do or feel unless you're in the thick of it. And as I've been starting, over the past few weeks, I felt it. And yeah, I posted on LinkedIn, kind of said, hey, I'm open to work. And got a ton of reach outs. Like I was extremely shocked at the power of the network because so many people reached out to me and said, hey, I'll talk to this hiring manager. I'll talk to this director, see if we can find a spot for you. And to be completely honest, I wasn't like thrilled about posting that I'm back to work, like doing my own thing. I feel slightly embarrassing, but that's how things are. So not like too worried about it. But again, so many people reached out and I was like, oh, this is awesome. Like I've never really asked for help from my network. And so this is the first time I did it. Got a bunch of referrals at companies that I think traditionally I cold apply to. Like I almost felt like, oh, a referral feels kind of cheap. Like you're not getting in by yourself. This time I was like, hey, if you're going to help me, like I would love a referral. Like just kind of went for it, put myself out there. Like I'm confident that I'll do well in the interview process to the best of my ability. And like, that's all you can ask for. And so, yeah, it was great. I was really happy to see people reach out and help out because I think in this job market, every little edge kind of gives you a lot. There's so many candidates. Recruiters are like overwhelmed with applications. There's some applications I've had that like are still unanswered and either they have too much of a stack or they're just like not hiring at all. Who knows? But it's really competitive and it's an absolutely different landscape. So you have to be really well prepared.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking, I don't know if this is true or not, but I feel like it either is true or it's close to being true, is you've been remote more than you've been in office, like you. I want to say working, because I can't remember when you graduated school and started working professionally, like full time, but it's got to be pretty close.
This was like July 2017. So if we think about that till when was COVID? March 2020 or something like that.
Yeah, so it's close. It's close.
It's
if
close.
It's not there. I don't want to do the math, but yeah.
It's definitely close.
Yeah, and it's interesting with hybrid. I feel like obviously companies need to make the best decision for what they think their workforce will do and respond to and all that. But I do a lot of companies that were remote and then switch to hybrid. Just feels like they're going to eventually just switch back to full in the office. Hybrid is the one to me that makes the least amount of sense. It's almost like either commit to remote or commit to being in an office. Hybrid is like you can't take advantage of like the benefit of like maybe working in a different state that has a lower cost of living and like be able to kind of move your family where you want to move but still be with the company you want to be with. But then being in the office, if you're going to say like, hey, being together is really important to our culture, then like we need to be in office. And it seems like that would be like a universal, like we need to be in office all the time kind of thing. If like we're really just driving the productivity is better kind of pitch on that. But, again, it's up to the companies, of course. I think companies spend a lot of time and resources trying to understand what is best for their workforce. And I think they make that decision independently, what works best for them. And it's, totally fair.
Yeah, cool. I've seen the trend of mostly smaller companies being in person, like OpenAI, Anthropic. These companies are like San Francisco, 5 days a week, And I get it. I think they're kind of grinding and in that phase of a startup and high pressure. There's definitely a handful of companies that are full remote, like manage your own time. We trust you, high confidence, high autonomy, but like still have a high bar of like you need to get stuff done. You need to be prioritizing correctly, executing correctly. And for my time at Meta, that was mostly how it was, of like, there was always too much to do, I felt, at Meta, and it was choosing the right things to do and then executing to your fullest on those projects. And so if we're looking for a new opportunity, definitely talking to like various sizes of companies, seeing what's out there. But at the end of the day, there's so much that goes into it, like product fit, people fit, like what tech stack they're using. Especially on the mobile app side, there's surprisingly a lot of different architectures and languages used, that finding one, if I have multiple options and choosing the right one, is going to be big. And then a lot of it's like vibe check. Like I feel like having interviews, talking to recruiters, like you can tell when people aren't interested. You can tell when people are kind of doing the bare minimum. I try my best to be on the opposite side of that. Like I usually always send follow-up emails, like try to respond quickly. And again, a little different for me since I don't have a full-time like job. Like I work for myself, so I have more time to spend to, get things right. But I feel like going the extra mile, being nice about it, thanking people for like, what their quote unquote job is, like never hurts. Again, I feel like when I posted on LinkedIn and people reached out to me who I didn't expect, like I really didn't expect a lot, I was thinking, oh, like probably cashing in, like oddly enough, on like just being a nice person and like helping others. Like, it all goes around. And I think in the interview process, it can be easy to, I don't know, not appreciate people for doing a lot of work, because there's a lot that goes into it: scheduling, talking, taking engineers'
Hmm.
time, like stressful for them, stressful for you. I've been on both sides. Like, if a candidate isn't doing well in an interview, in an engineering interview, it can be like not frustrating, but you want to help them. Like, you want them to do well. Everyone wants people to do well. So it's a lot of effort, a lot of time, like a lot on your mental. And so it's just like thanking people and going out of your way to make sure people are comfortable and happy. Like, I feel like it
Hmm.
really goes a long way, both in the workforce, like, and just talking to companies.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that extra effort, it's a little bit, effort is free and being kind
Hmm.
is free. And so just if you can do that, it's always, I think
Yeah.
it's easier said than done. But yeah, I agree. It's
Hmm.
definitely appreciated when you see it out in the workforce. Cool.
Hmm.
Well, let's kind of wrap this up here. We'll kind of go over our interesting bookmarks and topics for this episode. I will start, and I'm not going to spend too much time on mine actually, because mine is very much what we talked about already with Llama. So, for the sake of not being redundant, I just have a link from arstechnica.com about, the release of Llama 405B. And so it's a great read. Again, it goes over a lot of things that Brad and I discussed. One of the things that I will say that we didn't really touch on, we talked about the cost and how it'd be expensive, but in the article, there's a direct reference to how expensive it is. And I think someone estimates that it would cost something like $300,000 a year to like deploy that like on a full scale with like two
Hmm.
H100 NVIDIA servers. And I don't know how much those are individually, but this person saying, hey, renting two of these H100 servers for the year will cost you around $300,000 a year. And I remember being like, wow, that's
Yeah.
crazy. Like that's wild. Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. But then again, there's lots of other good details in there in the article, so we'll link that in the show notes. But yeah, I won't go too much further into it because again, we talked about it already during the show. But yeah, what you got?
Cool. Yeah, so this week I picked up a Twitter bookmark from Martin Bowling. And so he created a project that essentially optimizes your prompt for a smaller version of Meta's Llama model. So as we talked about, they have the 70B, kind of mid-tier, good enough, decently cheap, but also a little bit slower. Then they have the 8B model, which I think I might have said 7B, but 8B, I guess, is the official size, smaller, dumber, but cheaper. And so he created a tool, and what it does is it takes your prompt and it optimizes it for their 8B model. And so again, I haven't used it, but the thought process usually is get the smartest model, figure out your use case, and then scale it down. How far down can you go on the intelligence level that your use case still works? And so I think his tool is an excellent, you know, tool in your arsenal to say, hey, like my use case works with 70B, but it costs me maybe $2 per million tokens, and tokens would be characters in your prompt. But if I could bring it to Llama 3.1 8B, maybe that costs me 50 cents per million tokens. And so you can take that same prompt that you're working on, throw it into his like prompt conversion tool. That'll then fine tune it to make sure it works, just as well or better on 8B, and then test your use cases. So you can go side by side, throw in a few queries, see the responses, and it's the goal of how far can you go with dumber intelligence. I think this tool can help you scale that down much quicker. So yeah, pretty
Yeah.
cool. I'll link in the show notes, but again, start at the high, end up at the low. That's the goal. And I think if you can make that easier, who wouldn't want something like that? So this will be a nice tool to have.
Yeah, it helps with that tricky prompt engineering that you mentioned before about
Really
getting
hard.
that balance right. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
It's a good skill to develop.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome.
Cool.
Well, let's wrap this up. We'll put all our links in the show notes and get it all up on the usual places. But yeah, good stuff. And we'll do this all again next week.
Sounds good. See ya.
Cool. See ya. Hey, hope you liked that episode of the Break Even Brothers podcast. To find more of our episodes, you can go to breakevenbrothers.com or find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Transistor FM. To connect with Brad, you can go to bradleybernard.com or at bradleybernard on X. And to connect with me, you can go to bennettbernard.com or at the Real Tech CPA on X. You can also find us both on LinkedIn. Thanks. See you next time.